What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved actors walks onto a morning show set expecting a friendly conversation, only to be blindsided by a host with a personal vendetta? In just 45 seconds, George Stephanopoulos would say something so shocking, so completely out of line, that it would force Pedro Pascal to do what no guest had ever done before on Good Morning America: walk off the set in the middle of a live broadcast. The studio lights were bright that morning. Pedro Pascal sat down in the chair across from George Stephanopoulos, Robin Roberts, and Michael Strawn. He smiled at the camera, gave a small wave to the audience watching at home. He thought this was going to be another typical morning show appearance. Talk about his new projects, share a few laughs, maybe tell a funny story from set. He had no idea what was coming. George started the interview normally enough. "Pedro, thanks for joining us this morning." "Thanks for having me," Pedro replied, still smiling. "It's great to be here." "So let's talk about your career," George said, and something in his tone shifted. It became sharper, colder. "You've had quite the rise in Hollywood. Some people might say you got lucky." Pedro's smile faltered slightly. He glanced at Robin, who looked uncomfortable. "Well, I wouldn't say luck. I've been working as an actor for over 20 years. 20 years in small roles," George interrupted. "Then suddenly you're everywhere. Makes people wonder. You know what I mean? One day you're doing bit parts on crime shows. The next you're on magazine covers. It's quite the transformation." The studio went quiet. Michael Strawn shifted in his seat, clearly sensing the tension building. This wasn't how morning show interviews were supposed to go. This felt wrong. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Pedro said carefully. His voice stayed calm, but you could see his jaw tighten. His shoulders tensed. George leaned forward. "I'm saying that your success seems convenient. You show up in a Star Wars show wearing a helmet the whole time. Anyone could have been under there. Nobody even saw your face for most of it. Then you're cast in a video game adaptation. Some critics say you're just riding a wave you didn't earn. That you're more about timing than talent." Robin Roberts cut in quickly. "George, I don't think that's fair. Pedro has been nominated for multiple awards. He's been praised by directors and co-stars. His work speaks for itself." "Let him answer," George snapped at her. Actually snapped. At his own co-host, on live television. The disrespect was shocking. Pedro took a breath. "Look, I understand not everyone is going to like my work. That's fine. But to say I didn't earn my career? And that's incredibly disrespectful. Not just to me, but to every actor who has spent decades auditioning, getting rejected, working side jobs, fighting for every single opportunity." "Disrespectful?" George laughed. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was cold, mocking. "You want to talk about disrespect? Let's talk about how you've used your platform. All this political talk. All these causes you champion. Don't you think actors should just stick to acting? That's what people want from you. Is entertainment, not lectures." Michael Strawn tried to step in. "Hey, maybe we should move on to talking about the new project. I'm sure people want to hear about that." George ignored him completely. He kept his eyes locked on Pedro. "No, I want to hear this. I want to hear him explain it. You come on these shows. You post online, always with an opinion about everything. Immigration, healthcare, social justice. Who made you an expert on anything other than reading lines someone else wrote for you? What qualifies you to tell people how to think?" The audience gasped. You could hear it, this collective intake of breath. Even the camera operators looked shocked. Pedro's face changed. The politeness dropped away. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," George said. "You're an actor. You play pretend for a living. Why should anyone care what you think about real-world issues?" Robin Roberts looked like she wanted to disappear. "George, come on." "No, Robin, someone needs to say it," George continued. He was on a roll now, and he wasn't stopping. These Hollywood elites think they can lecture the rest of us. Pedro, you grew up in Chile, right? Came to America. And now you want to tell Americans how to think? Pedro stood up. Not quickly. Not in a rush. He stood up slowly, deliberately. He removed his microphone pack from his belt, placed it on the chair. The studio was completely silent now. Everyone watching knew something big was happening. I came to this country as a child, Pedro said quietly. His voice was steady, but you could hear the emotion underneath. My family fled a dictatorship. We came here with nothing. My parents worked jobs they were overqualified for, so my sister and I could have a chance at a better life. I worked for 30 years to get where I am. 30 years. George started to speak, but Pedro held up a hand. I'm not done. You invited me here. I cleared my schedule. I showed up on time. I was prepared to have a respectful conversation. Instead, you've spent the last 5 minutes trying to tear me down. For what? For ratings? To make yourself feel important? Michael Strawn nodded slightly. He wasn't disagreeing with Pedro. And yes, I do speak about things I care about, Pedro continued, because I'm a human being. And I have thoughts. I have feelings. I have experiences that shaped who I am. You don't get to decide that my voice doesn't matter just because I'm an actor. That's not how this works. George's face was turning red. I'm the one asking questions here. No, Pedro said firmly. You're not asking questions. You're attacking me. There's a difference. A journalist asks questions to learn, to inform, to create dialogue. What you're doing. This is just mean-spirited. Robin Roberts finally found her voice. Pedro, I apologize. This isn't what we planned. I know it's not your fault, Robin, Pedro said. He looked at her kindly. Then he looked at Michael. Or yours, Michael. You both tried to stop this. He turned back to George. But you sit there with your fancy desk and your television show and you think that gives you the right to demean people? To question whether they deserve their success? To tell them their opinions don't matter? I'm holding you accountable, George said, defensively. Accountable for what? Pedro shot back. For working hard? For succeeding? For caring about things? You're not holding anyone accountable. You're being a bully, and I don't have to sit here and take it. The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that studio. George tried to regain control. If you walk out of this interview, everyone will know what kind of person you are. Pedro actually smiled at that. Not a happy smile, a sad smile. If I walk out of this interview, everyone will know I have self-respect. They'll know I don't let people treat me like garbage just because they have a microphone. And honestly, George, I think they'll understand. You're being overly sensitive, George said. This is just how interviews work. No, Michael Strawn interjected. Everyone turned to look at him. No, man. This is not how interviews work. I've been doing this for years. This, he gestured between George and Pedro, this is not normal. Robin nodded in agreement. Pedro's right, George. This crossed a line. George looked at his co-hosts like they'd betrayed him. Are you serious right now? You're taking his side. There are no sides, Robin said gently. But there is respect. And this interview hasn't been respectful. Pedro picked up his phone from the side table. I'm going to leave now. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Michael. You both have always been kind to me. Wait, George said. The arrogance was cracking now. He was realizing this was actually happening. You can't just leave. Watch me, Pedro said simply. We're live, George insisted. You can't walk out during a live broadcast. Pedro looked directly into the camera. To everyone watching at home, I'm sorry you had to see this. I came here excited to share some projects I've been working on. Instead, I was insulted. My career was diminished, and my right to have opinions was questioned. I don't think anyone should have to sit through that. Not for a paycheck, not for publicity, not for anything. He started walking toward the exit. You could see the producers off camera, frantically trying to figure out what to do. Should they cut to commercial? Should they try to stop him? Nobody knew. This had never happened before. George called after him. This is very unprofessional. Pedro stopped. He turned around one last time. You know what's unprofessional? Ambushing a guest, insulting them, dismissing their entire career, telling them their voice doesn't matter. That's unprofessional. Me leaving, that's self-preservation. I was just doing my job, George protested. Your job is to interview people, Pedro said. Not to attack them, not to ambush them, not to make them feel small so you can feel big. Your job is to have conversations that enlighten, that inform, that help viewers understand different perspectives. That's what good journalism looks like. This was just you being mean because you could be. Learn the difference, because right now, you clearly don't know it. Robin Roberts looked at the camera. She was trying to salvage something from this disaster. Her voice came out shaky. We're going to take a quick break. But before they could cut away, Pedro had one more thing to say. He walked back to the interview area, but he didn't sit down. He stood there, tall and composed, looking at George with a mixture of disappointment and pity. You want to know the saddest part about all of this? Pedro asked. I actually respected you. I watched you for years. I thought you were a good journalist, someone who asked tough questions, but did it with integrity. But this wasn't tough journalism. This was just cruel. George's face went pale. I was trying to push back against celebrity culture. By targeting one person who came here in good faith? Pedro shook his head. That's not brave. That's not journalism. That's just picking on someone because you can. Because you have the platform and the power. Michael Strawn stood up too. George, I think you owe Pedro an apology. I don't apologize for doing my job, George said stubbornly. Then you don't understand what your job is, Pedro replied. He looked genuinely disappointed now, not angry anymore. Just sad. Your job is to inform people, to have meaningful conversations, to make viewers think. What did today's interview accomplish? What did anyone learn except that you can be needlessly harsh to a guest? The producers were signaling desperately now. They needed to go to commercial. This was spiraling completely out of control. I have one question before I go, Pedro said. Why? Why did you really do this? What did I ever do to you? Did I say something in a previous interview that bothered you? Did I turn down this show before and you took it personally? What is it? George didn't answer. He just sat there, looking at his notes, his pen tapping against the desk in a nervous rhythm. Answer me, Pedro pressed. You've been talking nonstop for the past 10 minutes. Surely you can answer one simple question. Why did you treat me this way? Still nothing. George's silence was louder than any words could have been. That's what I thought, Pedro said quietly. There is no reason. You just decided to make me your target today. Maybe you were having a bad morning. Maybe you wanted to prove something to someone. Maybe you wanted to show everyone how tough you are. Maybe you genuinely believe actors shouldn't have opinions, that we should just shut up and entertain people. I don't know. I honestly don't know. But it says a lot more about you than it does about me. Robin Roberts had tears in her eyes. Pedro, for what it's worth, I think you've handled this with incredible grace. You stood up for yourself without losing your composure. You said what needed to be said without being cruel back. That takes real strength. Thank you, Robin. That means a lot. Pedro gave her a small smile. Then he looked at Michael. Keep being one of the good ones, okay? Keep treating guests like human beings. Keep making this show a place where people feel welcome instead of attacked. Always, Michael said, shaking his hand firmly. You better believe it. What happened here today, that's not what this show is supposed to be about. And it won't happen again. Not on my watch. Pedro nodded. I believe you. Pedro walked toward the exit again. This time, George didn't try to stop him. The fight had gone out of the host. He just sat there, staring at his desk. But Pedro paused at the edge of the set. He turned back one final time. You know, George, the really ironic thing is that I came here to talk about a project I'm working on. It's about standing up to people who abuse their power. About finding your voice when someone tries to silence you. About refusing to be diminished. He smiled, a real smile this time. I guess I just gave everyone a real-life example. So thanks for that, I suppose. And then he was gone. See, he walked off the set of Good Morning America, past the shocked crew members, past the producers scrambling to figure out damage control, past the security guards who weren't sure if they should stop him or not. Back in the studio, Robin Roberts turned to the camera. We'll be right back after this break. Her voice was shaking. The second they cut to commercial, Michael Strawn turned to George. What were you thinking, man? I was trying to ask real questions, George said weakly. That wasn't questioning, Michael said, his voice hard. That was an attack. And you know it. Robin put her face in her hands. This is going to be everywhere. George finally seemed to realize the magnitude of what had just happened. Maybe I went too far. Maybe? Michael stood up, removing his own microphone. You absolutely went too far. You disrespected a guest. You disrespected your co-hosts. And you disrespected everyone watching. I've never been so embarrassed to sit at this desk. Michael, George started. No, I'm done. We'll finish the show, but after that, you and I need to have a serious conversation. Michael walked off the set too, heading toward his dressing room. Robin looked at George. He's right, you know. That was completely out of line. I was just trying to be tough, George said quietly. He looked smaller now, deflated. There's a difference between being tough and being cruel, Robin said. Pedro Pascal came here as a guest. He deserved respect. At the very minimum, he deserved basic human decency. And you didn't give him either. The commercial break was ending. The producers were counting down. 5, 4, 3, 2. They were back live, but the energy had completely changed. Robin did her best to introduce the next segment, but everyone watching could tell something had gone terribly wrong. The remaining hour of the show felt hollow, forced, like everyone was just going through the motions. In a car outside the studio, Pedro Pascal sat in the back seat. His hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, from adrenaline. He'd never done anything like that before. Never walked out of an interview. Never confronted someone so directly on live television. His phone started buzzing. Text messages flooding in. Calls from his publicist. Emails from his agent. Social media exploding. But he didn't look at any of it yet. He just sat there, processing what had happened. He thought about turning around, going back, trying to smooth things over. That's what the old Pedro would have done. The Pedro who spent years trying to please everyone, to never make waves, to always be grateful for every opportunity. But he wasn't that person anymore. He'd worked too hard, come too far, to let someone treat him that way. And more importantly, he knew there were people watching who had been dismissed, talked down to, made to feel small by people in positions of power. If he'd stayed in that chair and taken the abuse, what message would that send? Number. Walking out was the right choice. The only choice. Back at the studio, the show finally ended. George Stephanopoulos sat alone at the desk after everyone else had left. The crew was packing up equipment, pretending not to notice him still sitting there. He replayed the interview in his mind. Every question he'd asked, every comment he'd made. He'd convinced himself he was doing important journalism, asking the tough questions, not giving celebrities an easy ride. But watching Pedro's face, seeing the hurt in his eyes before it turned to resolve, hearing the disappointment in his voice, George started to realize that he'd just made one of the biggest mistakes of his career. He'd let his ego, his need to prove something, turn him into exactly the kind of interviewer he'd always said he'd never be. The kind who cared more about creating a moment than having a conversation. The kind who saw guests as targets instead of people. Robin Roberts walked past his desk without saying anything. Michael Strawn didn't even look at him. The silence spoke volumes. George pulled out his phone. He thought about calling Pedro, apologizing, trying to explain himself. But what would he even say? Sorry I questioned your entire career and told you your opinions don't matter on live television. Sorry I ambushed you when you came here in good faith. Sorry I let my own issues turn into an attack on you. He put the phone down. An apology now would seem hollow, desperate, like he was only sorry because of the consequences, not because he genuinely understood what he'd done wrong. Meanwhile, Pedro was reading through the messages now. Most of them were supportive. Fellow actors texting to say they were proud of him. Fans saying they respected him for standing up for himself. Industry colleagues expressing shock at what they'd witnessed. There was a text from his sister. I just watched what happened. Dad would be so proud of you. Pedro felt his eyes well up. His father had always taught him to stand up for himself, to never let anyone make him feel less than he was, to speak truth to power, even when it was scary. He'd done that today. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been comfortable, but it had been necessary. His publicist called. Pedro, are you okay? Yeah, he said, and he meant it. Yeah, I'm okay. That was intense. I know. I'm sorry if I made your job harder. Are you kidding? His publicist actually laughed. You just showed the world what integrity looks like. My phone hasn't stopped ringing. Everyone wants to interview you. Everyone wants to know your side. I don't know if I want to talk about it more, Pedro admitted. You don't have to. What happened on that show speaks for itself. You don't need to explain or justify walking away from disrespect. Pedro nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Thanks. Back in the studio, a producer approached George's desk. We need to talk about what happened. George looked up. I know. That can't ever happen again. It won't, George said quickly. I mean it. We had a guest walk off our show, during a live broadcast, because of how he was treated. Do you understand how serious this is? George did understand. Finally. Too late, but he understood. The producer continued. People trusted us. They trusted that when we invite someone onto this show, we'll treat them with respect. You violated that trust today. I was trying to ask challenging questions, George said, but even he could hear how weak it sounded. There's a way to ask challenging questions without being antagonistic. You know that. You've done it 1,000 times. So, what was different today? George didn't have an answer. Or maybe he did, but he didn't want to admit it. Maybe he'd been jealous of Pedro's success. Maybe he'd been frustrated by actors using their platforms in ways he didn't agree with. Maybe he'd just been in a bad mood and took it out on the wrong person. Whatever the reason, it didn't justify what he'd done. In his car, Pedro finally allowed himself to feel everything. The anger at being disrespected. The sadness that someone he'd admired had disappointed him so thoroughly. The pride in standing up for himself. The fear of what this might mean for his career. The relief that he'd stayed true to his values. It was a lot, but he'd handled it. He'd walked into that studio as a guest, and he'd walked out with his dignity intact. That mattered more than anything else. His phone rang again. This time it was Robin Roberts. Hey, Robin, he answered. Pedro, I am so sorry about what happened today. It's not your fault. I should have done more to stop it. I should have shut it down earlier. You tried, Pedro reminded her. You and Michael both tried. George wasn't listening. Still, you deserved better. You deserved so much better than that. Thank you for saying that. It means a lot coming from you. For what it's worth, Robin said, I think you handled that situation with more grace than anyone could have expected. You stood up for yourself without being cruel back. You said what needed to be said, and you knew when to walk away. And that takes strength. Pedro felt the tightness in his chest ease a little. I was worried I overreacted. You didn't. Trust me. If anything, you underreacted. I've seen people lose it for less. They talked for a few more minutes. Robin promised to reach out again soon. Pedro thanked her for calling. As the car drove through the city, Pedro looked out the window. People going about their days. None of them knowing what had just happened in that studio. Soon they would, though. And soon, everyone would know. But Pedro had learned something important today. He'd learned that he could stand in his truth, even when it was uncomfortable. He could walk away from situations that didn't serve him. He could demand respect, not just hope for it. He'd spent so many years being grateful just to be in the room. Grateful to be invited. Grateful to be considered. And that gratitude was valid. He was grateful for his career, for his opportunities, for the people who'd supported him along the way. But gratitude didn't mean accepting mistreatment. It didn't mean staying silent when someone tried to diminish him. It didn't mean sacrificing his self-respect for the sake of being polite. Inside the Good Morning America offices, meetings were happening. Urgent conversations about what went wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. Discussions about apologies and statements and damage control. George sat in one of these meetings, and being told about the reaction online. It wasn't good. People were calling for him to apologize. Some were calling for more than that. He thought about Pedro, probably in a car somewhere in the city. He wondered if Pedro was angry, upset, relieved to be gone. George realized he didn't actually know Pedro at all. He'd made assumptions based on what? His own biases? His own insecurities? He'd created a version of Pedro in his mind, and then attacked that version, without ever considering the real person sitting across from him. The real person who'd fled a dictatorship as a child, who'd worked for 30 years to build a career, who'd faced rejection and disappointment and kept going anyway, who'd earned every bit of his success through talent and hard work and persistence. So George had reduced all of that to got lucky and just an actor. He'd been so focused on tearing someone down that he'd forgotten the basic principle of good journalism. Seek to understand before seeking to judge. Meanwhile, Pedro's phone buzzed with another text. This one from a young actor he'd mentored. Just watched what happened. Thank you for showing me that it's okay to walk away from people who don't respect you. I needed to see that today. Pedro smiled. Maybe something good could come from this after all. Maybe someone watching had needed to see that standing up for yourself was possible. That you didn't have to accept poor treatment just because someone had power, or a platform, or a fancy title. The sun was setting over the city now. The day that had started with such promise, with Pedro excited to share his work, had turned into something entirely different. But he'd survived it. More than survived it. He'd emerged from it stronger, and clearer about his values, more certain of his worth. George would have to figure out his own path forward. Robin and Michael would have to decide how to move forward with a co-host who'd shown such poor judgment. The show would have to rebuild trust with guests and viewers. But Pedro? Pedro was okay. He'd stood in the fire and hadn't burned. He'd faced someone trying to make him small and had refused to shrink. He'd walked away from disrespect and toward his own dignity. And in the end, that was all that really mattered. Not the headlines that would come, not the think pieces that would be written, not the debates that would happen online. What mattered was that when the moment came, when he had to choose between being polite and being respected, Pedro Pascal chose respect. He chose himself. The car pulled up to his apartment building. Pedro gathered his things, thanked the driver, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new decisions to make. But tonight, he would rest easy, knowing he'd done the right thing. The hard thing. The brave thing. He'd shown the world, and more importantly shown himself, exactly who he was and what he stood for. And no interview, no matter how hostile, could take that away from him.